In September 1972, a reel-to-reel tape recorder was left running overnight at a remote hunting camp deep in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. The camp was accessible only by a 2-hour hike. No roads reached it. What the tape captured the next morning has never been satisfactorily explained in 50 years of analysis. The recordings are known as the Sierra Sounds. They have never been debunked. The story begins with Ron Morehead, a hunting guide who had established a remote camp high in the Sierra Nevada, accessible only by a 2-hour hike from the nearest dirt road. No vehicles could reach it. In the summer of 1971, Morehead and the hunters in his group began hearing sounds at night from the surrounding forest. Something large was moving in the dark, and it seemed on certain nights to be communicating. The following season, Morehead brought in Al Berry, a California journalist with a background in audio production. Berry carried professional reel-to-reel recording equipment and microphones into the camp. The plan was straightforward. Leave the equipment running overnight and retrieve whatever was captured in the morning. What they recorded over multiple seasons between 1972 and 1974 became some of the most analyzed audio evidence in the history of cryptozoology. The recordings are not simple animal sounds. They contain whoops, rumbling growls, and sharp whistles that layer and shift in ways that suggest more than one creature. But one type of sound has drawn the most sustained attention from researchers. They call it samurai chatter, rapid, complex vocal exchanges carrying a rhythm and internal structure that feels to the ear like language. The acoustic properties of the recordings were first formally analysed by R. Lynn Curlin, a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Wyoming, who spent over a year examining the tapes. His findings were specific. The fundamental frequencies recorded fell outside the range of known human vocal production. The formant patterns indicated a vocal tract significantly larger than a human adult male. The sounds, he concluded, could not have been produced by a person. Curlin's analysis was not conducted under ideal conditions. The tapes examined were not original recordings and had been transferred at least once before reaching him. He acknowledged these limitations in his report, but his structural findings, that the acoustic properties of the vocalizations were inconsistent with human production, have not been formally refuted. No subsequent analysis has produced a definitive counter-explanation for the formant characteristics he identified. The analysis that drew the most public attention came decades later. R. Scott Nelson is a retired cryptographic linguist from the United States Navy, trained to analyze, decode, and identify languages, including those with no prior reference material. He spent several years studying the Sierra Sounds in detail. His conclusion was explicit. The recordings contain a structured, rule-governed language with consistent phoneme usage and syntactical patterns. It is not human. It has never been identified. Nelson published a paper in 2012 mapping the recurring sound units in the recordings and arguing for a consistent linguistic structure. Critics noted that his methodology was unconventional and his conclusions went beyond what the data formally supported. Nelson acknowledged the analysis was preliminary. But he maintained that what he identified in the tapes is not random vocalization. It is language, and language, by definition, has a speaker. The location of the recordings is a significant part of the argument against hoax. The Sierra camp sat at high elevation in a roadless section of national forest. To place a person or group of people there at night across multiple seasons, with the equipment and consistency required to produce these recordings, without Morehead, Berry, or any of the other hunters ever detecting them, would require a sustained and logistically complex deception carried out over years. Physical evidence was also reported at the camp. On multiple occasions, large bare footprints, estimated at 15 inches, were found around the perimeter. Branches had been broken at heights requiring a reach of 8 feet or more. Food left outside was disturbed or taken. On one occasion, a large rock was placed to block the camp's water access. Whatever was visiting the camp was not small, and it was apparently paying attention. Al Berry described one of his direct encounters in detail. He was alone at the camp when sounds began close outside. He remained completely still. The vocalizations came from multiple directions, circling. He made sounds back. They were answered. He described the exchange as a communication, though he had no means to verify what was being conveyed. Berry took the recording seriously for the rest of his life. He died in 2012 without recanting a word. The argument for hoax is not without merit. The sounds could, in theory, be produced by humans using extreme vocal techniques. Throat singers can produce unusual harmonic frequencies that fall outside standard measurements. The remote location, while difficult to access, was not impossible to reach. And Morehead, who has since written a book and built a public profile around the recordings, had financial and reputational reasons to maintain their authenticity. Against this, researchers point to the consistency of the recordings across multiple seasons. If the sounds were staged by outside hoaxers, the same performers returned to the same remote location repeatedly, in all weather conditions, producing vocalizations acoustically consistent enough to satisfy a university analysis. They did so without being detected by experienced hunters with high situational awareness in a wilderness environment they knew well. The logistics are genuinely complex. Comparisons to other unexplained recordings have been made. The Ohio howl, captured in 1994 by a wildlife biologist, shares acoustic similarities with elements of the Sierra Sounds. Recordings from the Pacific Northwest spanning decades and dozens of locations bear structural resemblances to the Sierra material. No common source has ever been identified. No known North American animal has been matched convincingly to the full range of sounds across all of these recordings. Mainstream science has not engaged with the Sierra Sounds directly. No peer-reviewed study has been published examining the full original archive. The recordings exist in a space between scientific credibility and popular mythology, taken seriously by a small number of researchers with formal acoustic or linguistic credentials, dismissed without examination by the majority. This is partly a structural problem. Publishing a study on Bigfoot vocalizations carries professional risk in academic environments where the subject is considered settled. Ron Morehead has continued his involvement with the Sierra Camp for over 50 years. He describes sustained contact with a non-human intelligence across multiple seasons and locations. He does not describe fear. He describes a relationship of cautious mutual observation. The creatures studying the camp as much as the camp studied them. Whether this account is taken as evidence or mythology depends entirely on what the listener is prepared to accept before they begin listening. The most significant unresolved question is not whether the sounds were faked, it is this: if they were not faked, what produced them? The options narrow quickly. A known North American animal capable of complex vocalization, bear, mountain lion, elk, produces sounds that are documented and easily matched. None match the Sierra recordings. A human requires acoustic properties the analysis says were not present. An unknown large primate is the remaining explanation. It is not a comfortable one. The recordings have been released commercially and are widely available. Researchers who study them describe a consistent first-time listener reaction. The sounds are initially assumed to be some form of human vocal performance or a known animal. On closer listening, particularly the samurai chatter sequences, this assumption becomes difficult to sustain. The rhythm and call and response structure are hard to attribute to any single known source. The more carefully you listen, the less certain the explanation becomes. 50 years after the first recordings, the Sierra Sounds remain the most formally analysed audio evidence for Bigfoot's existence. They have been examined by a university research department and a trained Navy cryptolinguist. Neither examination produced a definitive debunking. Neither produced a confirmed identification. The tapes sit in an evidentiary gap, too specific and consistent to dismiss casually, too unusual for mainstream science to formally engage with on its own terms. The broader Bigfoot question frames the Sierra Sounds in a particular way. If Bigfoot does not exist, the sounds require a different explanation, one that accounts for their acoustic properties, their location, their consistency, and the absence of any detected hoax mechanism. If Bigfoot does exist, the Sierra Sounds are among the most sustained and credible pieces of evidence for its presence. The recordings do not answer the question, they simply make it harder to close. What is certain is this: something produced those sounds in a remote section of the Sierra Nevada over multiple seasons between 1972 and 1974. Morehead and Berry heard them directly. They recorded them with professional equipment. A university researcher examined the recordings and found acoustic properties outside the human range. A Navy linguist examined them and found syntactic structure. 50 years later, no one has produced an identified source. The tapes are real. What made them is not known. The Sierra sounds are not the most dramatic piece of Bigfoot evidence. They are, in some ways, the most uncomfortable. Film footage can be faked, footprints can be carved, eyewitness accounts can be dismissed, but 50 years of consistently unexplained audio with 2 separate formal analyses and no identified source is harder to categorize. Whether the explanation is an unknown primate or something else entirely, the recordings have not yet received the serious scientific scrutiny they appear to demand.